Welcome to Richplanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Tonight's guest will be well known to many of you. He's an ex-oilfield executive who now lectures, writes and broadcasts on the geopolitical webs that are being spun, with particular focus on US hegemony and the New World Order agenda for control of global resources. It's Ian R. Crane. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Richard. Thanks very much.
Now then, you've just embarked on a huge UK tour stroke campaign. You're lecturing all around the UK at 55 venues from now until the end of July. Just briefly spell out what that's about, Ian, and then we'll come back to it later in the interview. Okay,
well, obviously with my oilfield background, I've been very interested in following the unfolding strategy for developing shale gas in the US, in Australia, and in Europe. And I was really quite relaxed after the earthquakes in Blackpool, which were caused by quadrilla drilling and fracking in the Fylde Peninsula. And after that, a moratorium was put on fracking in the UK. And so I was quite happy with that, because in my opinion, fracking is not something that should be done on land. Mm-hmm. But in mid-December of last year, the British government lifted the moratorium on fracking, and although there hasn't been any significant activity in the last 4 months or so, the bottom line is that the companies that have got the production, petroleum exploration and development licenses from around the UK are poised to start their drilling, fracking and production programs, and I think the British public need to be aware of what is entailed here.
And just clear one thing up, was before that ruling, were they using fracking under the sea?
Yes.
Right, but it was just banned on land up until recently?
In the UK.
Right, okay.
And by the way, in some countries in Europe, and particularly France, and also Bulgaria, but in France, Francois Hollande has stated categorically that there is a moratorium on fracking for the duration of his presidency.
Right. Okay, all right, we'll come back onto this issue.
Okay.
But first, I want to ask your opinion on North Korea, because there's been so much hot air in the media about North Korea. Can you give us a 2 or 3 minute snapshot, Ian? What's your opinion as a geopolitical...
Well, this is classic deja vu. I mean, we are a little over 10 years, in fact 10 years and 3 weeks since the invasion of Iraq. And of course the invasion of Iraq was based on the false premise of weapons of mass destruction. And millions of people all around the world, of course, knew that it was a false premise. Millions of people hit the streets. I mean, 2 million people hit the streets in London. But Blair and Bush had their agenda. And of course Tony Blair infamously stated in Parliament that Saddam Hussein had nuclear missiles and could get them ready for an attack on the UK within 45 minutes. Well, interestingly enough, actually in a recent edition of the Daily Mail, Stephen Glover, who's a Mail columnist, he wrote this column. He says, "Forget the mafia, our establishment covers up its crimes better than anyone." And there we have the article right here. Well, this article basically is looking at the lies and deceit of Blair and Alistair Campbell. And of course, everybody in this country basically knows they lied. I mean, Tony Blair, we know he's lying as soon as his lips start moving. Yeah. And he's obviously appeared before the Chilcot inquiry, and the Chilcot report is being delayed mainly because the Civil Service, the Cabinet Office and the ministers are refusing to release documents appertaining to that particular period. Right. And then literally a week ago, David Cameron trots out almost exactly the same script regarding North Korea.
Yeah.
Now, my question would actually be, I wonder whether Kim Jong-un actually knows anything about this or knew anything about it until it started appearing on CNN. Because I think what we're seeing here is, one, an attempt to create a distraction against the continuing unfolding, manipulated global financial collapse. And also, let's not forget, of course, that North Korea is now one of the decreasing number of countries that are outside of the Rothschild central banking system. And the corporate globalists are determined to rectify that.
Yeah, so we've got North Korea, Iran is another.
Exactly.
Libya was one.
Yes, as was Iraq.
Venezuela.
And it'd be interesting to see what happens with Venezuela. Sudan was, of course, pulled into the central banking system. So that basically leaves Cuba, Venezuela. Obviously, after the recent death of Chavez, it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds.
So can I ask you for a prediction on North Korea, Ian? Do you think troops will go in? Do you think there'll be missiles fired within the next few years, or how do you see it panning out?
I think that's a possibility. I mean, let's recognise the fact that the run-up to every previous major war has been identified basically by a recession. Right. By an economic recession, and then they use the opportunity to effectively establish a belligerent agenda. There's a lot of people unemployed. They bring them into the military, and of course, what it does is it gives the bankers the opportunity to pump more money into the players, and then of course they hold those countries to ransom with the debt. Right. I mean, we're in a situation now where the bankers are literally in the final round of their game of global monopoly.
And of course, you and I would probably agree that player isn't really loyal to any one country. It's some sort of banking stroke military industrial complex oligarchy which remain behind a veil.
Exactly. And all of the names of the people that we know in the public domain, the likes of Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Blair and Cameron, Obama, I mean, these are not the decision makers. These are simply the actors on stage, following the scripts. And as we saw with Cameron, I mean, basically he was reading exactly the same script as Blair, and it's the absurdity that those behind the scenes who are pulling the strings think that the general public will fall for it, and unfortunately generally they do.
They do, yeah.
There's been a couple of episodes of Coronation Street and EastEnders since Tony Blair read out the script, and so people have forgotten it.
Yeah, exactly. All right then, Ian, well, let's come back to this fracking issue. Now, let's just briefly describe what is fracking. I understand it's getting predominantly gas, but also oil out of the ground using some fluid at high pressure. But just give us a bit more detail about it. Okay.
Obviously, we've been using oil. It's been the primary fuel source for the planet for, 130, 140 years now. And initially, the oil was literally coming out of the ground. I mean, it was oozing out of the ground in places like West Texas and Indonesia, Azerbaijan. And obviously for certainly the first sort of nearly 100 years or so, I suppose, we were tapping into the stuff that was relatively near the surface. And most of that was in reservoirs that were under natural pressure. So once you drilled into the reservoir, then obviously the oil or the gas seeks the point and path of least resistance, so it comes up the well and it can be then shipped to wherever. Sure. But then since the 1960s, then obviously there's been moves to get into the deeper oil.
Less obtainable areas.
Yeah, the less obtainable areas, and of course we moved offshore. The classic, of course, is the North Sea. Yeah. In the West, there's been a philosophy within the oil field to literally sort of bleed a reservoir until it just stops producing. Right. In Russia, they've actually adopted a completely different philosophy of reservoir management, where they monitor the pressure very, very closely, and when the pressure drops to a particular point, which their engineers have predetermined, they'll close in the reservoir, and they know that over a period of time the reservoir will actually replenish, and then they'll open up that reservoir again. In the West, because the philosophy has been literally to suck the reservoir dry, then the process of fracking came about in the late 1940s, and it was first developed commercially by Halliburton. But back in the 1940s, it was a question really of pumping water, ostensibly water and sand,
yeah,
under phenomenal pressure. And the reason that you mix it with sand is because you pump the water down the well under phenomenal pressure to fracture the rocks. That's where the term fracking comes from, to fracture the geology. So it's a tight geology. In other words, the oil and the gas doesn't migrate naturally or easily to the bottom of the well. So you've got to create porous pathways for the liquid or the gas to get to the bottom of the well. So having opened the geology, then what you want to do is you want to fill the cracks created, and it's filled with sand or silica to keep the fractures open.
Yeah.
Well, what's happened is over the last 60 years or so, the technology of fracturing has leapt forward, and the primary component in that leap in technology is the addition of a chemical cocktail. And by mixing the chemicals with the water, I mean, it's still ostensibly water, it's 95% water and sand, but then there's 5% of this chemical cocktail. And by the way, I can't tell you exactly what the chemical cocktail is, because the oil companies treat this information as confidential. It's proprietary information. It's what gives them sort of the competitive edge over each other.
I see.
But
acids is one.
Oh, acids, absolutely. I mean, these are corrosive chemicals. I mean, these are nasty chemicals. I mean, the oil industry claims that they're not using anything that you don't find in normal domestic products, or even claiming that they're not using anything that's actually found in food. And they may actually be right about that, but what they're not saying is what the quantity is. What we do know is that the 5% of the frac fluid that is the chemical mix is certainly not benign. And by the way, just to put this in perspective, to drill and frac a well takes something in the region, on average, of 4 million gallons of water. So 5% of 4 million gallons is 20,000 gallons.
And I did read, Ian, on one website, not sure how true this is, that this fluid loss when they do this, because they can obtain some of it, and it can be up to 70% of that fluid they don't sort of control.
Well, this is the issue, Richard.
It leaks into the...
You're absolutely right. This is the primary issue, because no geologist or petroleum engineer can absolutely guarantee what's going to happen when they pump that frac fluid down hole. I mean, obviously the purpose is to fracture the geology. I mean, that's why the client, the oil company, is employing the oilfield service company, Halliburton, Schlumberger, my former company, or Baker Hughes, to do this job, because obviously the oil company wants to maximize the life of the well. It wants to increase the revenue return by obviously increasing the flow of oil and gas, hydrocarbons, into that well. So they pump this fluid down under phenomenal pressure, something in the region of 7,500, 8,500 psi. And the reality is that once this stuff goes down hole at that pressure, they know it's going to fracture the geology in the immediate vicinity of the bottom of the well. But what they don't know is where it's going to go. And consequently, it doesn't necessarily just stop within the strata of geology that they're looking to open up. It can actually break out into other strata.
It'll just follow the path of least resistance, whatever that is. Yeah.
Exactly.
Which
and
could be miles away.
It could be miles away. And so consequently, when they flush the well after the frac job, I mean, they will claim that on average they get back about 50–60%. But you're absolutely right, they might get 10 or 20%. Right. And then it's lost. And where's it gone? Well, nobody knows. It effectively disappears. So now we have two problems. Because one, we have the problem of the frac fluid that has been brought back to the surface, and that's known as produced water.
right.
which is a misnomer, because it's not water, because it's no longer water and the frack fluid, it's also the debris that has been flushed out in the course of the frack operation, and some of that debris could well be radioactive.
Right.
In the US, they've actually been using a policy for 25-30 years of literally digging a pit by the pad and just pumping this produced water into the pit, and they're called evaporation pits, evap pits, and then the toxic stuff has just been literally evaporating into the air, and this has led to some very, very pernicious health impacts on people who live in these areas. We'll come back to that in a second. So what's happened to this 50, 60, 70% of water, or whatever it is, that's been lost combined with the frack fluid? Well, it'll migrate through the geology, and eventually it will end up in the water table.
Okay. All right then, Ian. Well, we'll talk more about this after the break, but before we go to the break, let's just fill viewers in on your lecture tour about this, and you're probably touching on some other issues in your lecture.
Of course. I mean, every lecture is brought up to date with current events as well. Yeah.
Sure. Now you're in sort of East Anglia at the moment. You've done Norwich and you're doing Cambridge tonight. So just give us a picture as to whereabouts you're going to be in the country over the next
all over
3.5 months.
Yeah, all over. Literally, I'm doing 2 presentations in Scotland, and in fact, the Glasgow event is I think about half sold out already, and I'm not there till June, and that's because Edinburgh and Glasgow are right in the heart of the Scottish gas fields.
Okay.
In England, I'm literally Carlisle, Newcastle, close to the Scottish border, and then right down through the country to the south coast. And let me tell you that 64% of England is sitting over shale gas or coal bed methane. So this isn't an issue that is limited to Blackpool, where Quadrilla have drilled their 2 wells. We literally are covering the country, because significant percentage of the population is going to be directly affected. And
just to mention something that you said to me earlier, this is something that could affect the property price of your house if they do start these activities around.
Well, I will show in the presentation that actually formal studies have stated that if you live within 2 miles of a gas rig, your property will probably fall in price by 24%. But the experience in Blackpool is that since the earthquake, which was April the 1st, 2011, the property market in Blackpool has totally collapsed. There is no market in Blackpool because people just don't want to move into an area that is potentially going to be drilled, fracked, and they run the risk of more earthquakes.
Okay, so if you want to see Ian speak about this and other issues, if you go to www.ianrcrane.com, is that right, Ian?
That's correct.
And all of the different venues and dates, it's in prices, ticket prices.
They're all evening presentations, they're all weekdays, they all start at 7:30 and we finish at 10:30.
Right, great. Okay, well join us after this.